Hello everyone, today we talk about Pre-Ottonian Germany and give a look at the political and social humus of the so-called Eastern Frankish Kingdom that encompassed, very roughly telling the truth, the modern country of Germany, and try to explain generally, of course, the reasons why the Ottonian dynasty rose as the leading political entity into this area, and how it managed to expand its strength beyond. We will not, telling the truth, talk about the Ottonian Empire or the Renovatio Imperii and all this stuff. We will just end essentially at Henry the Fowler and explaining which were the basis on which the Saxon dynasty managed to make it to the next steps, which is, I wouldn't say an overlooked topic, but it's still extremely important to understand in order to explain what came after. I will surely make other videos about the Ottonian dynasty in the future, more in detail about the empire and so on. But it's a kind of a fascinating environment, isn't it? I mean, when we say Pre-Ottonian Germany, we're really talking about something more like Post-Carolingian Germany, the Carolingian Empire having finished since the rise of Henry the Fowler to the rise of Henry the Fowler, essentially by roughly 30 years. So the Carolingian times weren't so far away at that point, nor it was the imperial ideology that still was present in the political in the ruling class of that time. And yet things have changed dramatically, if anything, because you understand that the empire at that point rose not in the usual Frankish lands that had seen the rise of the Carolingians, so this area between the Scheldt River and the and the Loire River, but in one of the most peripheral regions of the empire, and also one of the of least Frankish Christian identity, that was Saxony. It was a bit of a paradox that the descendants of Widukind would that had so fiercely fought against the Frankish conquest eventually would have gained the Frankish Empire, the Frankish crown in many ways. By the way, Widukind was an ancestor of the Ottonians as well, so or at least by their mother's side, the Ottonians, who descended by an obscure Carolingian count that had been set into Saxony after the conquest, were related to Widukind. So this is why I was saying I find it fascinating, because it's one of those powers who rose quite quickly, and yet with evidently strong strong forces, and that lived on through the empire and managed to reattach Italy to the northern crown and establish essentially what we called and would have been called after several centuries the Holy Roman Empire, as such, with Germany and Italy mostly, then also Burgundy and Bohemia and other lands. But essentially these two these two kingdoms, the German one and the Italian one, that even from an institutional point of view would have become unexcludable, let's say, the one from the other, because they both monopolized essentially the process of the imperial election through the election by the German princes and the confirmation of at least as king of the Romans, and then the imperial crowning by the hands of the Pope in Rome. after having gained the title of King of Italy, because that was really the point, that the Kingdom of Italy included Rome, and therefore the German kings named as King of the Romans had to protect that by assuming also the Italian crown. Well, this is what happened. We will be not talking about this, but there are certain elements of continuity in Pre-Ottonian Germany, even with the institutional asset of only the German kingdom proper, that we will be seeing in a while. So, as we know, the Franks had been the major power in Western Europe since basically the 6th century. There was a moment of eclipse of Merovingian power, especially during the second half of the 7th century. Then by the 8th century, the Carolingians come and are able to re-extend effectively Frankish power within and even beyond the borders of the Merovingian kingdom. And this was this very wide area that encompassed the parts of Western Germany, I mean from parts of Western Germany to the Atlantic Sea and the Pyrenees. So this very big area of Central Europe that goes from that encompasses today's France and parts of modern Germany and Benelux. And Charles the Great had greatly, obviously, renownedly expanded the empire much further east than the Merovingian penetration had been able to do, because the Merovingians began to expand into Germany, telling the truth, since an early age. Already by the 6th century, the Franks were kind of trying to make Germany a bit of a more habitable land in many ways, because Germany, even here at the time of the Teutonians, wasn't extremely different from a strictly environmental and natural point of view to the one of the of Augustus. You know, it was a relatively poor land with a relatively low potential at this time. The great expansion of Germany actually kicks in much later, during from the end of the 11th and during especially the 12th and 13th centuries. And in many ways, the areas of Germany had always remained backwards compared to the core of the Carolingian domains. And that's why, by the way, the Franks were so powerful, because they were settled into one of the richest, if not the richest, actually, areas of Europe of that time. And from there, they could draw the resources to wage war and a very long range, and to keep subjugated several populations that inhabited the surroundings of the same area. And Charles the Great famously completed basically the conquest of those Germanic populations that lived east of the Rhine. You can argue that West and Southern Germany had been to that point kind of Frankicized. We can't say. I couldn't find the right term. We'll be using this right now. And especially, it's not much that they were not Frankish in culture, but they had a very low Christianization level. In some measure, they were still completely pagan, because obviously they knew already Christianism, because the world at the time was pretty much into connection. It's simply that they had not been converted. They didn't they didn't feel the need to Christianize themselves, nor to organize their society into the model that at that time, incidentally, the Christian societies were being, and especially truly the Carolingian expansion that was a Catholic power. And also the regions east of the Rhine were, telling the truth, also quite lightly Latinized. There were certain regions that had known even a sort of Romanization. Think of the regions inhabited by the Alemanni, that however were part of the Frankish Empire since the beginning. But they didn't know Latin, and this meant simply that they didn't know Latin because they didn't write down at that point. And the Germanic peoples at that time, they normally didn't write. They had their runic alphabet, but it was used in a very different way from the writing culture that was spread all over, especially former Roman Europe. So these were, as I was saying, very different lands from the ones that more or less had, with all their differences, were within had been historically under the Frankish domination. Because, as I was saying, most of Frankish dominations were most of the Frankish domination was exercised on formerly Roman territories. Although we must say that if we look at the lands of the Franks, the very core that they called Francia, and that was divided in two, in Austria in the west, and Austria was it, and Austrasia, yeah, that's what, because Austria was in the land of the Longbirds. Austrasia was instead the eastern part of Francia, which is incidentally the part from which the Carolingians were originally home. Were actually quite similar in many ways to the Saxon lands. If you even read the Salian law, as and especially what is remained of it from the actual practice, especially in Austrasia, where in spite of having been for centuries under the Frankish administration, still largely relied on oral tradition like the Saxons, you can't see that actually the Eastern or better, the Austrasian Franks were actually quite similar to the Saxons in many ways, and there weren't such big differences. As a matter of fact, one of the factors that had allowed the Carolingians to have such a good military effectiveness is that they had been living on the eastern frontier at contact with the Saxons, which had granted them a greater militarization of their culture, and probably also a greater political and social cohesion, which incidentally had been lost in the Neustria, where the Merovingians had been ruling from. However, at the peak of the Carolingian Empire under Charles the Great, indeed, and Louis the Pious, indeed, Carolingian culture was fastly accelerating towards a strong Romanization, which was mostly needed for administrative reasons. And you can't say that the eastern regions, the newly acquired Saxon lands, lagged behind from that point of view. Yet what is important is that the Carolingians managed with an iron fist to include definitely lands like the one of Saxony into the Carolingian world in many ways, and there would be revolts. There would be it wasn't an easy process of integration, but it worked, and it worked so well that eventually the Ottonians would rise from there and re-establish the the Frankish Empire as it was still conceived at that time as such. However, we can see that those Germanic populations that, regardless of their, more or less recent integration into the Frankish Empire, did share some elements in common in terms of political culture mostly. And we can say that the Alemanni, so or Swabians, as you want to call them, already from this age, or the Bavarians or the Saxons, felt even after the progressive disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, they kind of fall into one group that was probably dictated by pragmatical reasons, in the sense that can say that the Carolingian Empire finishes in 843 as such, at least in its territorial unity, as it had been under Charles the Great and Louis the Pious. And the partition of the Carolingian Empire seems to have followed quite pragmatical reasons, but it seems to be also an implicit recognition that especially the western and eastern parts of the Transalpine territories were kind of different also from a cultural point of view. So that the areas of today's, let's say, of that region that stretched from the Rhine to the Oder River was called Francia Orientalis, or Francia Orientalis, which stressed that that was the eastern part of the old Francia. The old Francia meant as such, even though these, as we've seen, these peoples weren't, most of these peoples weren't Frankish at all, because the Italy, for instance, wasn't conceived as Francia; it was maintained as such. But the German lands that had been conquered by the Franks, lands that weren't Frankish, eventually came to be named as Eastern Frankish Kingdom. So that tells you that probably something really magic in a way had happened, that these peoples accepted to become Frankish as within the Frankish political system. They probably understood that at that point, where there wasn't much they could do, telling the truth, to free themselves from Frankish domination, that it was a good thing, after all, to be part of the empire, because the individual entities that made it, that were part of it, that made it up, could have a political potential that theoretically could rise them even to the imperial throne. And since the same Frankish Empire was collapsing, they understood that everything was right at that point. Everything could be useful to acquire more power on a local base, and yet they kind of made a body in some ways, and they began to recognize each other as Germanic peoples, as something more than divided Germanic peoples, but something that could be defined as German in the proto-national sense of the word. In fact, the western part of the Carolingian Empire was speaking already by then a substantially Romance language, that was the Old French, that was definitely heavily influenced by the Frankish language and also by the Celtic ones, but it was essentially a Romance language like the one spoken in Italy or in Spain. While the eastern part of the Carolingian Empire, north of the Alps, began to conceive itself as Teutonic, which is a word that you can at this point use interchangeably as German in the proto-national sense of the word, that actually comes from the word the ancient Germanic, the old Germanic word "Theod," which means people. And it's very important because the stressing that this was a popular identity really tells you a lot about what the local culture was about, because in France, where the Merovingians and eventually the Carolingians had set up this idea that they were the ruling dynasty that ruled everywhere, and kind of got much also of the ancient Roman tradition in this sense of an absolute ruler. The eastern half of the Carolingian Empire basically was still stuck to its local regional identities that were markedly Germanic in culture, and that stressed, in a certain sense, their individual freedom. The idea that, yeah, they were part of a system which was a kingdom, by the way, and therefore implied the election and the rule of a king, but that, however, was a kingdom still depending on the local regional governments, and that couldn't really push its power more than much. And this is actually when the German institutional, the basis of the German, the institutional the basis of the German institutional systems were laid, because at that point the Eastern Frankish kingdom began to work in that fashion and would continue essentially forever, because the kingdom of Germany was never really centralized, not even at the heyday of the Saxon or Salian or Swabian dynasties. So it was a kind of continuous iron arm between a tendency towards centralization, usually pushed by the monarch, and the one of decentralization and local autonomy from the local aristocracy. And let's say that the Germany, however, was still significantly different. This Eastern Frankish kingdom was very diverse in its local identities and traditions. A certain Latin influence was present along the Rhine and the Danube, because those had been the frontiers of the Roman Empire. They were the only urbanized areas of Germany, especially the Rhineland. And there would be differences, as I was saying, also between this same peoples that made up the kingdom, and much at that time was also caused. Much of this was caused by nature, because Germany at that time was very thickly covered in forests, forests that were so large at a point that they actually divided the actual historical regions of Germany that still survive today because of that reason. And the Frankish aristocracy at this point was kind of diluting into these local entities, because the Franks had always formally had this governance over the various peoples that made up the empire, but they they hadn't really a full control, not even in those areas that were of more ancient subjugation, or where the Frankish administration was more accepted. Essentially, the Frankish aristocrats, the Frankish nobility settled into these lands, had always had to deal with the local chiefs and with the various ethnicities that that had decided to adapt themselves within the Carolingian order. And it's evident that there was a lot of contractualism at this point. This is not a time in history when there are, political structures or even technological capabilities to keep such large territories under one control. So imagine even when the Carolingian Empire split in 843, that the Eastern Frankish kingdom at this point was a dominantly Germanic kingdom, with a Frankish nobility was essentially cut off from the original Frankish core of power, and this really means a lot in political terms, because if you wanted to keep rule on these lands as a Frankish king, as a Carolingian still, you would have necessarily to come to terms with the demands of the local resources. And it's very interesting that, telling the truth, after 843 the Eastern Frankish kingdom worked decently well, and obviously there were problems also in there, but there was probably one factor that helped the political cohesion of all these groups. That was the Slavic threat, because the Slavs at this time were, telling the truth, quite of a problem for the Franks. The same Carolingians had involved the Slavs during the conquest of Saxony, because obviously the Saxons bordered with the Slavs, and therefore they could make be a further enemy behind the Saxons while the Frankish were invading. And the part of the reason why the Saxon campaigns of the Carolingians eventually brought to Frankish victory is also the Slavic participation. But when the Franks occupied Saxony, now the problem was that the Slavs were just next door, and there were quite active groups of peoples at this time. So the Slavic world was really in motion at this time. They were living still part of the migration era in many ways. There were certain groups that inhabited around the Elbe River that would eventually migrate and settle in the Balkans at a point. So this tells that the Slavs had quite of a high kinetic energy. And the Eastern Frankish kingdom actually put a lot of effort to repel the Slavic incursions into Eastern Frankish territory, and waged a war against these tribes quite often. So this sort of catalyzed the process of coming together of the Eastern Frankish populations under a unique political direction, at mutual benefit in many ways, because at this point the situation was quite precarious in many ways. The Vikings were raiding the northern coasts. The Hungars would have soon arrived to from Eastern Europe to launch raids deep into Germany as well. So there was a certain level of a certain degree of militarization of the Eastern Frankish kingdom that contributed to the political development of the kingdom. The important, however, is to remember that although Germany was being Christianized and progressively Francized in parallel, they still sort of retained their own local identities and their let's call national customs. When I say national, I mean the idea of in the Latin sense of nation, that is the Swabians, the Bavarians, the Saxons, the Thuringians, etc. So populations that were conceived as nationes in Latin, which stresses a common birth essentially and common customs and stuff like that. So the consequence of this is that the Eastern Frankish kingdom characterized itself as a sort of federation of peoples, among which obviously certain were more or less powerful than others, and that however were easily recognizable at this point. Many people say, or tend to think at least, that when we say Alemanni, i.e. Swabian or Saxons, etc., we are talking even in post-Carolingian times as the same populations that they took their name from. Telling the truth, things had been a bit different from this, in the sense that the Carolingian government and Frankish domination in general had left their mark into these peoples, especially those who were present in the Frankish part of the Frankish Empire before the Carolingian conquest, had lived essentially a strong Frankization of their customs, of their aristocracies, of their elites. And even the original peoples that had given the name to even to the regions where these communities dwelled had largely mixed within the pre-Germanic populations, especially in the south of Germany, and therefore were something very different from the original tribes that had the original confederations that had made those peoples born. So this federation of peoples was equating essentially to saying, mostly to a confederations of territorial entities that for their different historical background had different stories, different customs, etc., but that conceived in that sense even chiefly as aristocracies and not really as the local peoples. And in fact, and think also about the same language that at this point they used. I mean, the kingdom of the Eastern Franks at that point was a fully Carolingian kingdom, even in its administration, which implied that administration was spoke and wrote in Latin, and that therefore the local aristocracies would have got to be used to use Latin as their administrative and political language, and they kind of there is a path of civilization in this process. They began to understand the advantages of having an organized kingdom, an organized body that could move as one, that could definitely privilege the same aristocracies, because another thing that the Carolingians had done at that point was to sensibly weaken the middle classes that had always characterized the Germanic populations at this times. These weren't much of stratified societies. There was definitely always an aristocracy, but normally the freemen enjoyed in spite of the aristocratic clienteles and stuff, a substantial freedom that was granted by the local right, the tribal right, that existed since the ancient times. The Carolingians instead, by exporting their vassalatic beneficiary system, had brutally accelerated the process of stratification of the German society. There had been quite a big problem, telling the truth, because think about the Ständigen revolt, in which the serfs had joined the freemen in revolt against the local aristocracies, because they were both understanding, including the freemen, that would have never mixed with the serfs otherwise, that the aristocracies were essentially taking all the cake for themselves, and they lost the struggle, because basically Germany began to become a feudal society in many ways. Always very imperfectly compared to France, that instead was much more advanced in this process, because they had practically got that base already from the Gallo-Roman society that was already quite strongly stratified, that had not been Germanized, socially speaking, in that sense. So a bit more of individual freedom remained in Germany on average, superior than in other areas of the empire. But generally speaking, the local German aristocracies were claiming, with their national name of the Alemanni, of the Saxons, to be, the old guys, the old freemen, the old nation, etc. But as a matter of fact, they were meaning at that point we, the aristocracy, and the rest just has to follow according to our decisions. And speaking of Latin in this sense, it's extremely interesting that in Germany there was an administrative division that there was one of the duchy that you don't find so easily in other areas of the empire, and the reason why this name was so used in Germany to define these territorial entities of regional scale, dominated by local peoples, let's say, is that they had a very strong military connotation, meaning that duchies were ruled by the dukes. This is where they take their name from, and the dukes was in Latin, and then inherited into the Germanic administration, the military leader. And therefore, this title stressed a superior authority that the local dukes was claiming. The rest of the Carolingian Empire normally had counties and marches. The counties were the normal, administrative repartition, and then the marches would be more militarized areas, usually placed in areas of frontier. In Germany you find these duchies instead that were such because they meant to recall the old military autonomy of the local aristocracies, and this is interesting because, telling the truth, they had the duchy had already been present before this age, telling the truth. I mean, they didn't rise as post-Carolingian political entities. They already existed before, and they normally were kind of more from the strictly Frankish point of view. It was a kind of it was a kind of resizement of a kingship entity, in the sense that, for instance, the Alemanni or the Bavarians weren't really um, sub-kingdoms within the Frankish Empire, but they were duchies. So they weren't. It was a lessening title in many ways. It was as if you're not even a people, you're not even a kingdom. You are just a duchy, and in this sense you have a one guy that rules there, but you don't have the regnum Francorum, the kingdom of the Franks, that extends its power even over you. But in Ottonian times, instead, this title was quite meaningful at that point, also because the Carolingian Empire didn't exist anymore, so even though there was a king, theoretically, at that point, these duchies were de facto, at least until the rise of the Ottonian dynasty, the most powerful political entities that existed at that point. That was remarkable, because in a world without a center, if you are at the top, even though you don't rule everything, but you're still, of the highest rank, that is a good option to. That means that you are the first one, among the first ones at least, that can extend and rise its power again, and reach for a higher level. And this is what the Ottonians basically did. And this, by the way, this name of the dux is a quite ancient one, because in Roman times there was already same usage. The Romans called duces the Germanic leaders that were such in virtue of their military role they had in leading their respective peoples. The same Longobards, for instance, had their kingdom divided into duchies because they had this very strong Germanic identity that was even stronger from a political and an administrative point of view than the one of the Franks, and therefore you find still even in Ottonian times the Duchy of Spoleto, etc. So it was something that the Germans were quite proud of. Or anyone who was claiming, at least from a political or juridical point of view, a German legacy in their personal power. The major peoples of Germany at this point within the Eastern Frankish kingdom were the Franconians that lived in this area between, let's say, over the Rhine and the Main rivers, so a bit of in the center of Germany. And these were this was a people that, as you understand from the name, it's like saying a German and Germanic. These weren't Franks, but they were Franconians, which meant that they felt themselves a bit of the heirs of the Franks in Germany in many ways, because they inhabited lands that had been those lands that had been mostly colonized by the Franks since the early Middle Ages. They also inhabited quite rich lands, because the Rhine and the confluence with the Main River had sensible political centers scattered all around. So it was quite of an important element that, not surprisingly, the Ottonians would try to ally with themselves with when rebuilding the empire. In fact, Ottonian Germany was essentially a Saxon Franconian dominated kingdom. Then there were the Swabians, or the Alemanni, as you want to call them. I just made a video about the Alemanni that explains actually the onomastic problem, in the sense that the Alemanni was the name of the ancient confederations of largely Swabian peoples that called themselves Alemanni in front of the foreigners, but called themselves Swabians, as you know, their ancient historical identity. Hence, the Duchy of Alemannia would become eventually into low medieval Germany the Duchy of Swabia, which was located in fact in the southwest of Germany, and also north of Switzerland and Alsace in eastern France today. Then there were the Saxons in the northeast, famously, so this area that even during Carolingian times lived the, kept living its own Saxon identity, because it's not the Carolingians wiped the Saxons out. The Saxons actually were quite proud of their origins, even during Ottonian times. They might refuse the fact that they had been enemies of the Franks in ideal terms, but they were still kind of proud of their own military prowess. For instance, that there would be the Bavarians in the southeast. Bavaria at this time, by the way, was a huge entity that encompassed namely also parts of Italy, but the actual core of power was in today's Bavaria and Austria. It was a frontier area, and one that, by the way, suffered the most of the Hungarian incursions, and that, telling the truth, even made great part of the work in repelling them, although the Ottonians eventually stole their, the merit through the Ottonian propaganda. I will be talking about that in some video about military history. So these lands are so important that, as I was saying before, regions as Franconia and Swabia and Saxony and Bavaria are still the names of certain historical regions of Germany today. And therefore the main consequence of this repartition would be that the royal the royal election would be fought within these dukes, these major four dukes that we repeat were the ones of Franconia, Swabia, Saxony, and Bavaria, and that obviously were divided accordingly, because they fought against each other quite regularly, I'd say. And even when the king was objectively elected, the other dukes that had been contrary to that appointment would say, well, we don't recognize you, point. So what are you going to do about it? And it's a pretty, and objectively at this point the king had only a formal power over them. Yet, as I was saying before, during especially the beginning of the 10th century, the situation in Germany began to worsen because of the Hungarian invasions, and therefore in spite of the fragmentation of the public power, not just within the Eastern Frankish kingdom because of dukes, but even within the same dukedoms, the same duchies, brought necessarily the dukes to come together to find a solution and to repel the Hunger threat. So it's at this point that the Ottonians managed to rise, because there was a general consensus that the Duke of Saxony, Henry I, called Henry the Fowler, because he loved falconry, and that was already a pretty widespread aristocratic activity at the time, was elected as Eastern Frankish king, and he would rule from 919 to 936. He was famously offered the even the imperial crown at a point, because the imperial problem was still there. I mean, there was not just Eastern Francia at that point. There was still the idea that all the parts that made up the old Carolingian Empire still existed. Today we say the Carolingian Empire ends in 888, where Charles the Fat dies, and no, technically not. I mean, the idea of the empire remained always there. The fact that there was no emperor, or that the imperial crown was given to people like, I don't know, the duchy, the dukes of Spoleto, because he was close to Rome and could make himself crowned by the Pope, doesn't actually, and there were many claiming to the imperial throne, doesn't actually make it, the end of the empire. There's actually a continuity, and the local aristocracies would always conceive, in spite of the growing political fragmentation, that theoretically that there was an emperor, an empire at least, and it was not just one empire. It wasn't the empire of the Franks. It was meant to be the Roman Empire, the Christian Empire, as all the propaganda and ideology had pushed for at that point. And famously, Henry the Fowler said, okay, to me it's enough just to be King of Germany. I don't care to be something more. I don't deserve that. Very humble, but it was also a very clever political move, because he wanted to show that he wasn't too greedy. And actually, how did the Ottonians made it at that point? Well, Henry was, as a king, wasn't trusted, with a certain degree of political power. He basically reorganized the administrative and military organization of the kingdom. He had a substantial power that was increasing. He probably inherited part of the military system that the Carolingians had put in place in order to defend Saxony from the Slavic raids. He fought against the Slavs because it was a regular thing. We are talking here about a typical Carolingian, post-Carolingian, feudal, as you want to call it, and situation in which it was a seasonal warfare, campaigns waged every year against that people or that other, and it was normal to wage war. But in parallel with this, Henry had also managed to build up an infrastructural system made up of fortresses, more or less. They weren't just military defenses at that point. They were political and economical tools of control over the local lands, and this had allowed him a quite consistent power and military strength, and it's famous, in fact, the Battle of Riade, at which he defeated the Hungars in 935, and he also subdued the Slavic peoples that lived between the Elbe and the Oder River. So in this time in which there was no political center of reference, no universal authority, what really mattered was to build up your own power from the basis, really from scratch. And this is what these guys managed to do. They managed to create a core of power from which they could wage war over this or that enemy, and to progressively kind of, I wouldn't say integrating it into the whole system, but making it a client in many ways, and a new political pawn to use in the various in the political international chessboard, and to to convince at the same time, and by exploiting the problems that existed, firstly the hunger threat, etc., to entrust to a certain to themselves a certain political power. And this, by the way, was also part of Germanic tradition, because the Germans were famously quite jealous of their independence, but they elected a chief in times of war. Then when war was over, everyone would come back, minding his own business, including the chief. And obviously there would have been always exceptions to this rule, for which a quite powerful chief would try to go a bit farther. Here, in a certain sense, the thing was facilitated because warfare was endemic. There was no other way to make things work in many ways, even from a merely civil point of view. So what the Saxons did was to arrive at a certain point and exploit the situation, and making the right choices, fighting quite hard, being actually quite great military commanders. I mean, the victories over the Hungars here are some of the most famous battles of the time, because they also showed how much the feudal heavy cavalry that the Carolingians had put in motion as a system was developing, and was basically collecting its fruits, and it was incredibly versatile, even in certain occasions. It wasn't easy to fight against the Hungars. The German terrain maybe helped a little, but there was a lot of skill and prowess involved to fight such an enemy, and men like Henry the Fowler or Otto I were firstly military commanders. There would be people living half of the year literally on horseback all the time, and constantly training, and constantly prepare for war. Even at the organizational level. So war in this sense was also kind of a pivotal system for developing political power, and not just the other way around. So it was a pretty substantial achievement that the Teutonians will definitely reached. So for now I would like to stop also, because oh my god, it's an hour. Sorry for being speaking so long. I hope I gave a bit of an idea of Pre-Ottonian Germany. Then I will be talking about definitely the Ottonians in the future, so stick around if you're interested. So for now, I just thank you as always for listening to me. If you liked the video, please share it, or leave a like, or subscribe to my channel. And I thank you again, and I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.